Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you happenstance into this discussion with the impeccable couple that sits on my left. We're recording this on Thursday, March 13th, 2025, at noon my time, and a lot is coming at us. And so, this recording, the panels that we're currently involved with, that we're trying to roll out on a consistent basis, is to react at the speed in which things are taking shape. Obviously, in our national dialogue, based on what's happening to the federal government and all things the Trump administration. And, one of the things that I wanted to touch down upon as we move forward is that I'm already beginning to see signs that people are organizing. People are beginning to groundswell demonstrations in a variety of ways. There's one scheduled tomorrow in Washington, D.C., on the National Mall. Don't know what kind of turnout it's going to have, and don't know exactly what the direction is going to be. But I want to premise this to both you, Bill, and June, and I'll put their descriptions of who they are. But those of you who are seeing these more and more often, you'll become second verse of who these two experts are and their relationship to what we've been trying to get forward for a long time with the revelations of widespread corruption and what we can do about it. Now, picking up on what I was talking about, just to kind of introduce this dialogue today, in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, my first endeavor was I made a documentary film called Forward 13 Waking Up the American Dream. And it was, as it turned out, prologue to everything that I would learn from Bill and much more that I would learn later from June and everybody else that's a part of our group that we've been able to assemble as a result of me continuously being on this journey to understand that there are professionals who know how the system works, who've gone the distance forever, who have basically lived with integrity and courage their entire careers to be able to thwart incredible corruption that most of us aren't aware of, quite frankly. And I say this in lieu of potential demonstrations that are going to start this national outpouring. In fact, the one that's happening tomorrow, Bill and June, is basically the causality is to demonstrate the threat to our constitutional republic, to the Constitution, is what it is really what the initiative is, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, great. So these people are aware that we're a nation of laws and separation of powers, and everything that's happening with Doge and all things Trump is one thing. But in the aftermath, guys, of the great financial crisis, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement. The Occupy Wall Street movement manifested the 99%, which was the revelation that none of us had talked about in our national dialogue before, the disparity of wealth. And that led in a lot of directions, but it led in the immediate aftermath, the police showing up to encampments all around the country and putting down, the law to break up these encampments very quickly, or let's say the perversion of the law, in a way to break down the First Amendment and the ability for us to protest, of course. But what I experienced firsthand, and also that's carried with me the entire time, is that when you don't have focus and direction on what is the centerpiece of everything, you end up being not effective. You end up watering down and saturating what initially was what everybody was looking for. So in the context of the 99%, what they were missing was the corruption that created the reality. And as such, nobody could get to really the heart of the matter. So what I'm trying to convey and to inspire, I hope, for all that are watching this and all who can share this and all who can get this up the food chain to bigger podcasters and so on and so forth. June and Bill have been in the center of fighting corruption in really the corporatocracy for now decades. We know people in this strata who have answers, who know how to lead us forward, if only we can understand the composite of all of the stuff coming down on us, to understand that there are ways to maneuver forward in a way that is composite to the way our system was designed before it's complete, before all is lost. So on that note, I just mentioned to you guys before I hit record that the latest news is that a federal judge had just ordered that Doge firing thousands of, I guess, temporary employees has been I guess, not redrawn, but shut down, quashed, whatever. Maybe you guys can pick up with that, and then we can lead into further dialogue. And by the way, David K. Johnston just arrived, and I'll admit him as you answer this question.
Sure. Good. Well, I'd like to take a big picture on all of this because when you look at the question of corruption, it doesn't start with the government. It doesn't start with the failure of the government to crack down on it. It starts with the pervasive corruption of corporate America. So you go back and you look, and I take a broad view on these things. You go back and you look at the rise of industrialization, an enormous accomplishment. Indeed, by the time of the Civil War, part of what divided North and South is the North was rapidly industrializing and wanted tariffs, and the South was not wanted free trade. And the economic divisions compounded the cultural and ideological divisions about enslavement that led to the Civil War. But by the time you get to the 1890s, the rise of manufacturing has created enormous inequality. The Gilded Age is about corruption. There are recurrent fraud-fueled financial crises that recur on a regular basis. In the private sector, in free markets, very little government response. And the progressive movement, the ideas in the progressive movement that lead ultimately and lay the foundation for the New Deal is the idea that you have to reinvent government, that you need big government to take on big business. And the only way you actually get really efficient private markets is if you were to enforce antitrust. But that's not what happens. What happens is it gets so bad, and it gets so bad when the industrialists turn from simply using companies to rip people off to using finance, the financial system, and a whole set of abuses rooted in finance that then produce the Great Depression and a depression on a global basis. And only then, when they crash and burn, do you get the will to do something about corruption. And that corruption and doing something about corruption is not just putting the bad guys in jail. It's really fundamentally rethinking the system. The big New Deal measures were, first of all, control of finance. You have deposit insurance tied to heavily regulated institutions. You have a clear distinction between commercial banking, what we think of as ordinary banks, and investment banking, that is backing stocks, the issuance of stocks that are going to be traded on Wall Street. You make the system relatively simple and easy to regulate because you eliminate the incentives for the massive corruption that occurred during the lead up to the Great Depression. We haven't been thinking in those terms at all. We've been thinking of markets as efficient as things like the financial crisis' aberrations. But what's going on is the systematic corruption of corporate America, the elimination of the guardrails, the temptation to cheat about everything, and the ability to cheat and get away with it. And the number of things unexamined, just massive. We haven't looked at the change in corporate America. We haven't looked at the way Mitch McConnell killed the response to the financial crisis that was working for average Americans, created a fiscal cliff. Teachers have still not recovered from the decimation of federal funding for education that happened because of Mitch McConnell's fiscal cliff. And Barack Obama, Matt Iglesias has a piece this week talking about how Barack Obama, who was chastened by his loss in 2010, went around saying, well, I guess jobs aren't coming back because of automation. No, jobs didn't come back because of Republican policies in Congress. The working class did not recover until they began to recover in 2016, finally. But Wall Street started recovering by 2011. And Main Street and blue collar workers in particular did not recover because of Mitch McConnell's policies in Congress. What Donald Trump is doing now is worse in many ways for the working class, for transparency, for the long-term health of the American economy. We're going the way of Brexit, which was a disaster for Great Britain. And it's just we may take the rest of the world economy down with us.
Wow, was that a powerful response? David K., welcome to the conversation. I'm just going to set up the question that I had posed, given the latest information that we had. And I'm going to, because right before you joined, I had posed this question to both Bill and June. But the setup was we just saw that a judge orders thousands of federal workers reinstated. This in light of all of the Doge disaster that's on our plate, in addition to the several conversations that we've had that preceded this, where we've got a lesson, quite frankly, beginning in the 80s, moving forward, starting with Jack Welch and the corporatocracy and the methodology that has seemed to transpire, particularly the deregulation that Bill is, of course, an expert in, where we saw Elon literally plagiarize what we show in the con, a guy by the name of, they refer to as Chainsaw Gillerin, obviously to cut through the bureaucratic red tape, send the message that, we're going to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, et cetera. But further to that question, I wanted to just lay the groundwork because in my evolution, following the 2008 great financial crisis, my first sort of pathway to what would reveal all things Bill Black, which would lead me to you and others in the whole system, right? That we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the focus was the 99%. It was disparity of wealth. But then, of course, the police response to put it down never allowed it to get to the reality of the questions I had to ask over the course of the last 14 years. Everybody was looking at the disparity of wealth, but they weren't looking at the causation of corruption, nor were they understanding what we had already done successfully through the savings and loan crisis, but that we didn't do in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. So what I was cautioning the viewers out there, and also the podcasters that are going to be, looking at this conversation as we move forward, that right now there's a kind of a sort of a splintering of a lot of different sort of protests starting to happen all over the United States with immediate reaction to all things Doge, right? But without, again, just like Occupy Wall Street, a hyper focus on the lessons that we've learned and the reality of corruption and the way we fix that corruption, which you guys have all been in the midst of for now decades. Can we find a pathway forward, in my opinion, right? So I look at you guys as the integrity, the courage, and the North Star of what needs to guide what we collectively have to do as a society to get out of this madness. So I'll leave it to you two, Bill and David K., to jump in and respond to that, and then move it forward to what is really top of mind for you.
David?
Well, I think you have to go back to the founding of our country, and more importantly, to the framing of our Constitution, which were done by different sets of people. The framers of our Constitution were deeply concerned about two matters. One of them was the passions of mobs, and they were all very familiar with Athenian democracy and how the system there allowed for change, but made it difficult for someone to seize and become a new tyrant. But they were also very concerned about institutional corruption. They understood there are always going to be individual acts of venality. There are always individuals who will engage in bad behavior. What they didn't want was for the government to be corrupted and for its regulation of commerce to be corrupted. Well, in recent years, we have seen the institutionalizing of the very corruption that was the concern of the framers. The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, but most notably in McDonnell involving the former governor of Virginia, effectively said, you can bribe elected officials, just don't call to bribe. So long as you don't say, gee, Governor Patrick Lovell, here's $1 million for doing what I want. You just say, gee, Governor, what a great job you're doing. My company is so appreciative. And by the way, here's $1 million. That's not a bribe, according to our Supreme Court. Similarly, in campaign contributions, in a series of decisions, Buckley, Vallejo, and most importantly, Citizens United, we've said free speech and dollars equate. That means then that you want to have a democracy of the moneyed, for the money, by the moneyed. And that's what we're seeing happen. And those things simply are not compatible with having a free and democratic people where the liberties of the people are what matter first and foremost. Now, we can create systems that encourage virtuous behavior. We can also create systems that reward vicious behavior. So one of them is just starting to take place, and I haven't seen any news accounts about it yet, except in one specialized publication. Now, the scandals that Bill uncovered and figured out involving savings and loan resulted in several changes, but one of them was the state of Texas changed the rules on partnerships. Historically, partnerships, which get very favorable accounting for tax purposes and are almost never audited by the government. Last time I looked at the numbers, it was less than 1 in 400 partnerships were audited by the IRS. So it's a tiny, tiny sliver. The state of Texas changed the rules. If we were all four of us partners, even though we're in different locations, and I figure out one day, Patrick, you're a crook, you're doing something that doesn't sound right. If I don't intervene, I can lose my house because we are, as the law says, jointly and severably liable for any damages. So Texas passed a law that created limited liability partnerships. Why should you care? Well, same fact scenario. I'm come to realize you're doing something crooked in the name of the company of the partnership. I'm protected other than my shares in the partnership, so long as I don't stick my nose into your tent. But the minute I go to you and say, what the hell are you doing? I'm now liable if I can't stop you. And we have seen with the rise of this lots of garbage accounting. Waste management being sort of the perfect literary example, the garbage company that had garbage accounting. When Michael Armstrong was the head of AT&T, he ordered a study by economists on the staff. How could MCI WorldCom, run by Bernie Ebbers, possibly be charging the rates they were and super low long distance rates and reporting phenomenal and growing profits? His staff came back to him and said, well, they can't. The only way they're doing this is by cooking the books. He didn't speak out about it. He didn't say anything about it until after it was all over. Now, maybe they went quietly, and we don't know the record of this, to the FBI, but Bernie Ebbers ended up going to jail, and it was, in fact, all fraud. And what you're seeing now is the state of Arizona just allowed KPMG, one of the big four accounting firms, and we should really have at least 10 big accounting firms. We should break up these big four. They have just allowed KPMG to have a law license. Now, why would an accounting firm want a law license? Oh, I think that's very easy if you know the law, which all of us do. It means that when the government comes to the accounting firm and says, we need to see the accounting records, they can say, oh, I'm sorry, no, legal privilege document, confidential privilege documents. Accounting records don't have that kind of protection, especially from tax authorities, but legal documents do. And why do I say I'm confident that's their game? Because they did it in Australia. And Australia has not exactly identical law to America. It's more English than American, but nonetheless, it's Anglo-American law, and that's what happened in Australia. And I think the game here has been around for a long time. We started to see the big accounting firms hire lawyers, and I wrote about this, 25 years ago. And the object is to avoid accountability. So now we put in the Trump administration. It only took Donald Trump a month, 26 days to be exact, to become America's dictator. And to be clear, Donald Trump is our dictator. He has asserted, both on Truth Social, his website, and X, he who saves his country violates no law. That's a made up quote attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, but that also was taught to Donald by his second father, the man he calls his second father, the notorious lawyer Roy Cohn. That's an assertion that he is above the law. Given Donald's statement in his first term, I have an Article 2 that says I can do anything I want. Article 2 says nothing of the kind. It's not very long. If you're watching this show, just open up your browser, put in U.S. Constitution, read Article 2. You will notice that basically what it says is the president, whose duty is to faithfully execute his office, is there to be the errand boy of Congress. He's to do whatever Congress tells him to do, and he's commander in chief of the military. That's it. He does not have any unlimited authority. But Donald believes that he is the only person fit to be president. He said that in 2012 and 2011. And I've known Donald since 1988. Trust me, he absolutely believes that. He believes he's special. The rest of us, we're just either tools to be used or objects to be overcome. And Donald now has created this fictional agency, Doge. It doesn't exist. It is not, it's extra constitutional. And yet news accounts every day say the Department of Government Efficiency, there is no such department. And it is furthermore, it's by the way, the Department of Government gross inefficiency from what's happened so far. Without legal authority, they have been firing people, tying up money, breaking and entering into computer systems that should be treated as felonies, except that the Attorney General of the United States is the utterly corrupt Pam Bondi, who has a long history of corrupt actions on behalf of Donald Trump, including shutting down, when she was Florida Attorney General, her investigation of Trump University, an utterly, completely fraudulent outfit that harmed many Floridians. So what you have now in the White House is a man who believes he's utterly unaccountable. He is surrounded by zealots like Russell Vogt and Kash Patel, who know generally what they're doing, unlike Donald. Donald is an utterly incompetent manager, as I've documented in the 3.5 books that I've written about him. And they are in the process of doing what Steve Bannon said they were going to do almost 8 years ago, more than 8 years ago, deconstruct the administrative state, by which they mean they're going to burn down the federal government. They are preparing to steal the Social Security Trust Fund. They are cutting the IRS by half. You know, the IRS is, in terms of revenue to the federal government, what surgeons are to a hospital. They're the people who bring the money in. The last time we had good data on this, which is only a few years ago, the very best paid federal corporate auditors, people who had not only master's degrees and CPA and typically a law license, but further advanced training, LLM training, for example, their all-in cost to the taxpayers was a little over $200,000 a year if they lived in the very high-cost areas, San Francisco and Hawaii. You get extra pay if you live in those. If they lived in Des Moines, Iowa, not even $200,000 a year. And they were finding, on average, $20 million a year each in taxes that were due. That doesn't mean we collect them, but that's what they found was due. No company or business that has somebody who costs $200,000 and brings in $20 million cuts those ranks. You hire people. You hire them until they're bringing in maybe $500,000. And that's not what we're doing. The IRS has been told to cut 50% of its workforce. So what they're really doing here is arranging a massive scheme to take from the many and give to the rich. And Donald Trump's tariffs are a part of this. No business owner, and I've owned a business. I've been the chairman of a two-bit little company, $2 million a year, but very profitable company. And I've run various other enterprises on the side throughout my life. And you have to know what you believe will roughly happen in order to invest money. if Donald Trump flip-flops day in and day out, and I haven't seen a single news organization say he's flip-flopping, by the way, on tariffs, you're not going to invest billions of dollars in new factories. That would be crazy. Oh, all right. Well, we're going to build a new auto factory here in Michigan instead of, or New York instead of in Ontario. No, not unless you're certain things are going to be stable. And so, what Trump is doing in setting up the tariffs is something that is being completely missed in the national news. In fact, I literally think, except for me and one person citing me, nobody else has reported what I'm about to say. Tariffs are a scheme necessary for developing countries like America was before the Civil War in order to build up financial muscle in domestic industries. So imagine, Patrick, that you make Lovell cars and you sell them wholesale to your dealers out the factory door for $10,000 each, and you make a $1,000 profit. So you got a nice business there. And there are Chinese cars that sell for the same price. We don't know their profits, but we know they sell out the door to their dealers for $10,000. Well, if Donald puts a 60% tariff on the Chinese cars, they cost $16,000. You're not going to keep selling cars for $10,000. Only an idiot would do that. You're going to raise the price to $15,000. That means you're going to make a profit of $6,000 a car. And let's assume because of the higher price, you only sell half as many cars. You're going to make 3 times as much money as you were making before. The tariffs are a scheme to take money from the people who support Donald Trump and anybody else who's not a gazillionaire and redistribute it to the very narrow band of people who own companies that benefit from the tariffs. Now, this is not getting the attention it needs for 2 big reasons. Well, 3 big reasons. The first one is the Democrats don't know how to communicate. I mean, and this is not a new thing. People like Bill and June and I have been saying for, I don't know, 30 years, you guys need to learn how to market. They don't get it. They don't get ideological marketing. When Bill and I were young men, we were told to buy a British product called Brill Cream. And if we put this grease in our hair, girls would be all over us. Well, it was nonsense. But you know what? The owners of Brill Cream got rich, very rich, because they sold a lot of it. And you can persuade people to all sorts of things if you understand marketing and advertising. And the Democrats, instead of having slogans that touch people in a visceral way, instead of understanding how to appeal to them where they are, they want to say to the people Donald calls the poorly educated, well, if you read my 47-point plan, you'll notice that in point 18 at footnote 6, and Donald comes along and goes, we love you. I alone can save you. No one else can save you. We love you. And that appeals to these people who've been beaten down since 1973 when the incomes of the bottom 90% peaked. So that's part one. The Democrats just can't figure out how to message. The second element in this is that Donald has persuaded his followers and many other people that people like me, journalists, are paid liars. When I do talk radio, people ask me, how much does George Soros pay you? And I say, he doesn't pay me anything, never has, directly or indirectly. Yeah, well, you're just lying about that. Why do you lie to people? When I was covering Daryl Gates, the police chief of Los Angeles, I went to a speech he was going to give one morning to about 800 people came every week to this breakfast meeting near the zoo for older people called the Riverside Breakfast Club. And he asked me to stand up in the audience, and I did. And I made it a point to hold my tape recorder in my hand, and I made a little turn to the audience, smiled nicely, and sat down. He said, that man, what he says, I say in the LA Times, it's all lies. He makes it up. So when the speech was over, I was surrounded by old people who came up and said, why do you make up quotes from the chief? And I said, I don't. He said, well, yes, you do. He said you do. And I said, did you see my tape recorder? Everything you read in the LA Times quoted to him, it's either in writing or it's on my tape recorder or it doesn't get in the paper. So why do you make up quotes? And it was for me a very early lesson in what Fox News was able to do with audiences and Donald's ability to persuade people that if he says it's not true, it's not true, even though he may be lying through his teeth and often is. So he's persuaded then the poorly educated to trust him. And they don't know any better because, more than half of Americans read below sixth grade level, and more than 1 in 5 reads at third grade or below. Third grade is ages 7 and 8. And if you can't read at the third grade level, you're functionally illiterate. I mean, you can go to the grocery store and buy products and whatnot, but you don't have any critical thinking skills. And I don't care if you were the smartest kid in your sixth grade class, and that's probably all four of us. You didn't know jack. You're 12-year-old. The third element in this is that Donald has completely removed accountability. He's not going to have any independent investigation by the Attorney General because those are his personal lawyers now. He doesn't have to worry about FBI agents getting reports and then digging into things and finding stuff because that's his personal police force now. He's fired, I think it's 13 inspectors general. There are a little over 20 of them. The inspectors general are the people Congress created in the 1970s to be in-house watchdogs. And I have read and written about various of their reports for decades. And in the beginning, they found a lot of stuff. But as time went by, the reports became, it's like reading Norwegian newspaper investigative reports. They're such an honest society, they have to make something out of somebody figured out how to trick parking meters or something. Just insignificant. The last time a significant corruption, waste, or abuse problem was found by the Inspector General for the U.S. Agency for International Development was more than 20 years ago. And if you go read the IG's reports, it's just minor stuff. I would attribute it to the general problems of very big, complex organizations and their accounting and lack of supervision and not enough money. And by the way, AID spends among its salaries, I think it's 40% essentially on ensuring you don't have corruption. He has similarly appointed people to run various agencies who have no interest in obeying the law, and they openly declare this. We have created a criminal administration. In the rest of the world, people see this. If you read the British newspaper, The Guardian, I subscribe to about 20 newspapers online. You read The Guardian, you will learn more about the corruption in this administration than almost anywhere else. In the New York Times, where I was a reporter for many years, you will find stories there, but they're often, weeks after Little DC Report, the organization I co-founded, reports them, or after The Guardian reports them, and then they're written in a way that just blunts what's being said. The New York Times has always been this way. It rarely speaks in plain, tough language the way tabloids do. It's wrapped up in, highfalutin language that doesn't drive the point home. And we've just seen today the Wall Street Journal, of all organizations, Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal, break the story that the Trump family has been talking with the people behind one of the cryptocurrencies, people who were apparently engaged in criminal activity, trying to make an alliance with them as the government is going to hold on to crypto. Now, there's no authority to buy crypto in the budget anywhere. And so far, they haven't done that. But the U.S. government owns billions and billions of dollars of the crypto seized from drug traffickers, money launderers, and others. And the Trump family, who've always been criminals since the founder of the family came to America in 1885, Donald is the third generation head of a four-generation white-collar crime family. They don't break legs. They don't kill people. They steal and they cheat with broken promises, contracts, devices like that. They're now running the country. And it's very clear what their intent is. The rich don't have nearly enough, and the rich who are with Donald are going to get richer by various means that should be treated as criminal. And if you stand up and you're subject to federal regulation, which means almost everybody who's in business, well, we'll come and destroy you. He wants $20 billion from CBS over its interview with Kamala Harris. We have the transcript of the interview. There's nothing wrong with their report, but Donald doubled his demand from 10 billion to 20, and it's going to force a lot of expenditure on lawyers to fight this. The Cooey Perkins law firm, which represents Democrats and progressive causes, He's now taken away security clearances, which lawyers need if their client has a national security case, and banned them generally from entering federal buildings. These are just flagrant First Amendment and Sixth Amendment violations. Who's going to stand in his way unless it's the courts? And most disturbingly of all in this line, in the recent decision about Trump not paying contractors who've already completed work. It's classic Donald. There are cases on the record, I've written about some of them in great length, where people have done the work for Donald, it's all accepted, and then he just refuses to pay you. Well, Justice Alito upheld the notion that he was in the dissent, fortunately, in the minority, that we don't have to pay these contractors for AID who'd already performed their work. Contracts are so important, they're in the Constitution. That's how crucial they are. And if you adopt the position and claim you're a conservative that you don't have to pay for work already done, I don't know of a clearer declaration to the world than we are now a kleptocracy. We are not we are not under the rule of law. We are being led by a dictator who can do any damn thing he pleases. But try and find what I've laid out to you in the mainstream American news.
And hence why we're together. And Bill, a lot to respond to there. I just want to pick up just briefly, and maybe you can think about this as you're moving through what the appropriate response is to what both June and now David Kay have laid out. To that point about Perkins Coie, in addition to that, Covington and Burling, right? Because of Jack Smith. Now, I have to point this out because of our work. We know what these high white shoe law firms were able to do on behalf of Wall Street, okay? And now it's incredible to consider that Donald has framed these guys as a threat to national security, maybe ironically, but that he's not aware of, that gave him the opportunity to move forward. And I think about, look, the easiest representation of it was there was a great movie that came out 2 years ago called Amsterdam. It features Robert De Niro. It was written or directed by David O. Russell, stars Christian Bale and David K. Washington. And it was about really ultimately the industrialists of the United States playing roulette with America first, obviously, which Rachel Maddow had revealed during Ultra. But what their game was as the ramp up to World War II, that furthers this notion of these industrialists that played ball with Hitler, and we know what happened to a lot of them. It just seems to me that the corruption, which is the centerpiece of everything that we're discussing right now on the way through it, that unfortunately we've had decades of the power and the money playing ball with enabling everything that is creating what looks to me like the end of the line, which you just said. It's the kleptocracy or the cacotocracy or whatever we're calling it these days. So I just wanted to kind of plant that in your head, Bill, if maybe you could address that as well, in addition to whatever direction you're going to go.
Sure. So I'll just build on some of the things David was going through and some of the things that you and June have addressed as well. First, the United States was a teeny tiny federal government until the Civil War. Depending on which source, the entire federal budget at the beginning of the war was roughly $40 to $60 million. We were funded almost entirely by tariffs, right, at the federal level. There was no federal income tax until the Civil War. The federal government did not issue currency, right? That was done by private banks until the Civil War. And in the era after the Civil War, it was also our financing was dominated overwhelmingly by tariffs again. And those tariffs were so high that they produced record budget surpluses in most of the years after the Civil War up till you get into the First World War. And from that period, 1865, the end of the Civil War, to the beginning of World War I, the United States was in recession half of the years. And not just any recessions, 3 of those recessions were called some variant of Great Depressions.
Panic.
Right? But they invented the phrase Great Depression to label. We eventually abandoned that historically, and we only think there was one Great Depression. There was no Federal Reserve. Money power was entirely in New York banks and one particular New York banker who also ran the railroad trusts, which was the biggest trust in the United States. So running a surplus year after year after year is the best way of producing a recession. Right? And we managed to demonstrate that. And the fact that Trump has learned nothing from this era. Also, do a little history, right? Taking on Canada as the United States, kind of dubious. I was born in Detroit. That was our most ignominious defeat without firing a shot. You know, the general, the American general, was actually sentenced to be executed, though that was, he got relief from the president and wasn't actually executed. Perhaps some of you remember 54-40 or fight. That was our struggle with Canada about where the Oregon Territory was going to be. So it was going to be a lot farther north, 54-40, where it's actually at 49. So we haven't done too well in our struggles with Canada, and Trump is getting his teeth kicked in at this juncture by the Canadians and the Mexicans. Okay, let me really pick up on David's points in terms of what we think of as white-collar criminologists and my actual experience fighting these epidemics of more elite frauds, right? It's audacity, not genius. Trump ain't no remotely genius. Most of us that deal with these kind of people put them in the C- to D+ range in terms of fraudsters, right? But audacity can carry you an enormous way if you got the capacity to deal with even the crappy fraudsters, right? And that is exactly what we've done. Any effective New York AG for 40 years could have put Donald Trump out of business in a year and a half of effort, right? With a competent investigation, he would have been dead meat. You could see what would happen. The man cannot take the stand in anything. He can't be deposed in anything without producing a catastrophe, right? As a former litigator, enforcer type, this would be the dream person to be cross-examining, right? Back to the thrift debacle, right? Everybody knew what the thrift debacle was because economists told us. And it had nothing to do with fraud, supposedly. It was just people taking honest gambles for resurrection. It was only when we looked in detail at every single failure, we realized, no, none of them acted in a way that would be consistent with an honest gamble. I mean, not that it was just a few of them, I mean 0 of them did so. Every single one of them was actually a deliberate policy of looting. And you could see if you actually investigated the way a competent reporter, a competent regulator does, what was happening. But if you just listened to the economist, you would never investigate. So one of our mantras was, if you don't look, you don't find. And that's mostly what happens. Any competent prosecutor could have convicted Trump of multiple felonies early on for the course of decades. I would say slightly different. We're not at all sure that the Trumps never used violence. I mean, Dad was at the Ku Klux Klan rallies and stuff.
Donald has never used violence, to my knowledge.
To our knowledge. But these folks will unleash violence, right? we've already had this first time around where he literally wanted to shoot protesters. And then when the general said no, he said, well, why don't we just shoot them in the leg? Like, you know, an AR-15 or an M4 carbine with the hypervelocity rounds. If they hit the major bone in your leg, the systemic shock can kill you within seconds, right? You don't shoot people in the legs, American peaceful protesters, or even mildly violent protesters attacking buildings. Apropos David's point about why accounting firms want that ability to say, oh, no, we're a law firm. You can't look at us. Charles Keating was a lawyer, kind of a high-level lawyer. He put in writing, highest priority, get black, kill him dead. That's kind of stupid, right? And then he withheld it as attorney-client privilege document. So yes, that's exactly what they're doing in the accounting ranks. We made criminal referrals against what was then the most prestigious audit firm in the world, the one that the other seven hate. This is the era of the big eight. AA, Arthur Andersen, which had a long history of being the entity most associated with better ethics in auditing. And they allowed themselves to be extorted by Charles Keating. And they wanted to withdraw as auditor. And to do that under the SEC rules, you have to do a short statement explaining why. And it's always in, vague type stuff and never terribly candid, but that's what they drafted. Keating responded that if they filed that letter, he would sue them. And he then dictated through a course of about 5 iterations exactly what they would write. And instead of a concern about Lincoln Savings accounting abuses, it became a screed against the regulators, which were used to recruit the 5 U.S. senators who became known as the Keating Five to attack us. That AA memorandum allegedly explaining why they were going to withdraw from the audit. So usually when your top tier auditor withdraws from an audit, that's a really, really, really bad thing that investors are going to react to. Keating, again through audacity, twisted what should be an enormous embarrassment into yet another weapon. And I'll stop at one more, and David's point. I had, in the early era as a regulator, 2 big jobs. One was litigation director of the agency, and the second was at the staff level leading the reorganization of the agency to actually enforce the law and to target these fraudsters, right? Despite that, I spent thousands of hours, or not maybe despite that, but because of that, I spent thousands of hours talking to the media and making sure that our complaints were written in English and as opposed to legalese, and that they were narratives that explain why this is a scam, a fraud, a bad thing. And then I would spend many, many, many hours with reporters, not just national reporters, regional reporters all over the place, explaining what all of this stuff meant and why it was bad and why it wasn't just bad luck or any of those things. And we knew we'd finally succeeded when one of the sleaziest members of the House, a guy caught up in the postal banking scandal of that era, started wearing a button that was literally this big, over 6 inches in diameter, that said, "Jail the S&L crooks." Now, it was completely disingenuous, but it was a signal that you won. Here's what's happening today that all of us have been saying. Trump doesn't care. Trump is saying, not just saying the quiet part out loud, he's screaming the quiet part out loud because he wants you to know that he's corrupt. He wants you to know that he has corrupted the rule of law, that he has turned the Department of Justice into an oxymoron led by regular morons, but vicious ones, that they will go out and they will enjoy destroying all that made America great. They will go after the law firms and they will go through all the other things that have been institutions that tended to create the best incentives. And that would include the inspector generals, mostly not because of those reports, because they're the only protection, meaningful protection for whistleblowers. And the United States has an absolutely unique level of whistleblowing compared to any country in the world. And it's one of our greatest assets. They're going to attempt to destroy that. They want to advertise, again, the illegality, the corruption, the openness of it, the willingness to use force with made up facts to lie is all to intimidate, to get people to surrender in advance. That is what we must not do.
Can I just add to Bill's last point? Imagine for a moment you're the CEO of a publicly traded company. You have an obligation to the shareholders. It's not the obligation most Americans think to maximize their return. That's just nonsense as a matter of law. But it is your obligation to safeguard the assets of the company and to husband those assets. And if you have an administration that says you will toe the line with us or we will find ways to destroy your company, you're in a very tough situation. Beyond that, you may get fired if the company's stock price falls significantly. The problem that you've got is you're going to stand up for principle, and the white collar crime laws aren't going to be very helpful to you in that regard, because they weren't written with that as an expected problem, a predatory administration.
Well, we're closing in on our time today, and I'll come back to you, June, just really quickly. I want to set this up for closing comments if anybody has anything further. But look, the Department of Justice, and I don't think we got to this in this conversation, has just now gutted the anti-corruption task force. So this is just an extension of everything you guys are talking about. But again, to reiterate what I'm trying to get you, the viewer, to understand it, and why you have to share this, and why you have to tune into this, and how we're going to get this to every podcaster as these dialogues continue to grow, is that we all know that the country is under assault. We all know that the country is taking its lead from billionaires. If you want to interpret that as Elon Musk, because that's your focal point, there's a lot more in the game, and we've corrupted the Supreme Court. We've corrupted, obviously, every agency that exists. Like Bill just said, it's so out in the open. You have to be a fool and eyes wide shut not to understand what this means. And if you believe that a plane can fly without integrity, I dare you to get on that plane. We are in a situation where the establishment of the separation of powers, the integrity of our institutions that were helmed by professionals throughout most of my life, but have been eroded because of, let's just say, political appointees at the heads of a lot of these institutions over the course of time that continue to basically turn inside and out what June had said at the beginning of this is a runway to this understanding that this is not only the history of the United States, but quite frankly, the history of the world. You could always look at absolute power corrupting absolutely, but at the end of the day, we have professionals. We have people that have been in the trenches. The faces that you're looking at here have fought this fight their entire careers and have done it miraculously against all of the headwinds, not to mention, when you look at David K. Johnston, he was at the New York Times, the paper of record. What he's been telling us is why Donald Trump should have been arrested decades ago. And now some people are listening, but listening as he's the president of the United States, where they just did a hostile takeover of the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Pentagon, and the Treasury, among everything else, right? So we're starting to see a surge of people finally at wit's end because they're now on the crosshairs. when millions of people were already in the crosshairs. But the fact of the matter is, until and unless millions of us galvanize with the understanding that we have people in our system that have the courage, that have the integrity, that are veterans of these wars for decades, and that we turn our attention to them, we're all going to once again flutter and saturate and not be a we the people's legitimate defense to this onslaught that is destroying everything that matters to us as Americans. In June, I revert to you for closing. I hope that didn't sound too emotional, but we've all been on a long journey. I'm just a quarter of what you guys have done.
So let me talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground. This is about the rule of law and reclaiming the rule of law. One of my law school classmates, Albert Foyer, has been trying to organize folks to figure out what to do. And it turns out there are the following groups on the ground already. The ACLU was planning for a new Trump administration long before the election. The state AGs have been planning for this long before the election. They filed some of the major lawsuits that are getting some of the TROs you were talking about. What they need is not so much volunteers, but people to organize the volunteers. So I've talked to our law school clinics that do a lot of immigration law. They're overwhelmed with people, little people, calling up saying, what is my immigration status? With federal employees calling up and saying, how do I fight back? How do I protect my job? What recourse do I have? This violates the civil service laws. The unions have been very active in bringing some of the major cases. This is the kind of time when you absolutely need unions. Unions are as much about fighting back against corruption and the organized political power of the billionaires as they are about anything else. So, back in the 70s, one could debate the role of unions. Today, unions are on the front lines. All of these groups, and they're fighting for publicity, for attention in our attention economy, as Chris Hayes' new book talks about, is that they are working to assemble groups. So one of the things the state AGs have been doing, these are the Democratic attorney generals in a variety of states, is holding town halls in places where Republican congressmen won't hold town halls. And they've been trying to gather information about what cases they should be pursuing. This gets almost no publicity, which is striking compared to, Donald Trump hawking Teslas on the White House lawn. But these are the groups that are beginning to fight back, and you're beginning to get some organization. And it is the lack of organization of a focal point for the protests. And then there's the question of how do you reassert the rule of law? So I will say on the Supreme Court, without going into a lot, I see three groups on the Supreme Court. There's John Roberts, Kavanaugh, and maybe Gorsuch, who have been motivated by repeal the New Deal. They view the entire body of law that started in 1936, and 36 is when the Supreme Court moved away from Lochnerism, the idea of the fat cat's rule, that markets should be free for exploitation. That was overturned. The move away from it started in the 30s. John Roberts came of age with a group associated with the Reagan administration and the Federalist Society who want to repeal all the protections that have protected workers and consumers since the 30s. Okay? There's a second group led by Samuel Alito, pure grievance. The dissent you mentioned that Alito wrote recently, how dare a federal district court judge issue a nationwide injunction about USAID? Well, he said the exact opposite when it's a Texas district court doing things related to abortion. He has no integrity, not an ounce, pure grievance. He could be out there in the streets with MAGA. And then there is, and I will pick Amy Coney Barrett, and I think it is important we defend her. I don't agree with her on lots of things. What I am struck by is she wishes to be a justice of the Supreme Court. not an ideologue, not a partisan hack, which is all that Alito is. And what characterizes her? She wants to apply the law in the books, the law in the statutes, the law and precedent in a relatively good faith way. Yes, she doesn't believe in abortion rights, but she really takes being a justice seriously. And it's important to emphasize, I think, that what the court as a whole, not over the few years since Trump appointees stacked it, but what the Republicans on the court have been doing for decades is they embody a great man, and I mean man, theory of history. The great men, the Elon Musks, the Donald Trumps should be freed from the rules that apply to everybody else. Bureaucracy is a terrible thing. Justice Gorsuch loves to write about some poor fisherman who turned out lied and destroyed evidence, but he's the victim in Justice Gorsuch's narratives. They don't believe that any politician should go to jail for doing what Clarence Thomas does every day. And so what you've got is a court that is in effect blessing lawlessness. But when you call them on it, the center, not the grievance, but the center shifts a little bit. And what has to happen when this is over is the bar associations, the professions have to go after this guy. The Democrats in Congress on the Senate Judiciary Committee have filed a bar referral for the acting U.S. attorney in D.C., who is instigating politically motivated investigations and who has appeared in court and asked for the dismissal of a case as U.S. attorney in which he had not yet stepped down as defense counsel in the same case. There is no greater conflict of interest. So what you've got are breaches of law and legal ethics so egregious, there has to be accountability sooner or later. And we have to discredit the people who say Clarence Thomas gets to take $1 million from his friends, and oh my, there's no conflict of interest.
Well, in closing, thank you for that, June, and thank you for all of your times this afternoon. I don't want to take up any more time today. I know that you've got many things to do, guys, especially I know, David, you're all over the place, and thank you for everything that you're informing and educating the public about. And of course, Bill and June, as always. But again, I have to emphasize this as we close, right? So June has gone at great lengths to describe to us the historical pattern of the sacrifices that enabled us to get to a point where the actual law was more powerful than the robber barons or any form of tyranny that had preceded it, to a point to where, you know, obviously the government of the United States with its ideals that we put down in the Constitution of separation of powers could actually work. And we had a period of time that happened after millions of lives had been sacrificed, after the suffering was global, that the level of sacrifice was beyond what any of us could actually comprehend. Well, not you guys, because you were closer to it than I was, but in terms of our personal lives, the sacrifice and the destruction in our lives and how it would touch us and impact our lives so that we could move forward in order to form a more perfect union. My question to you people are, do we have to go that far, or can we rally around the professionals and be smart and actually rise concurrent to create a critical mass to simply turn the tables on corruption, to demand that the rule of law is supreme in the United States? So I'll leave it with that. That's enough of my stump speech. But as we move forward with this, I hope that we can impact people and hopefully create an emotional reaction so that we all come together to be able to purge this tyranny, to create a renaissance of possibility. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll be in touch with everybody as we move forward. All the best. Onwards and upwards.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.